In part one of this series on Soviet heavy air-to-air missiles, I looked at the AA-3, the AA-4, and the AA-5. Having covered the lesser known but more widely deployed weapons of this type, now I'm going to turn my attention to the real hype beasts. Up to the late 1950s, the PVO's main concern when guarding against SAC's bombers was the length of the border. This led to the Fiddler and Firebar long-range fighters, and then thousands of Su-9 through 15 interceptors that were used for area defense, and an array of MiG-21Ps for point defense. The threat came from a mass of B-52 Strato fortresses that could either come in very high or more likely very low. Then came the B-70 Valkyrie, which would have been able to ingress to target at over Mach 3. None of the existing aircraft had a realistic chance of intercepting such an aircraft. Unless they were precisely positioned astride the B-70's route and they could shoot head-on, the bombers would simply outrun short-ranged missile attacks. Concern over the Valkyrie led to the MiG-25, which is in itself a fascinating and in some ways an outrageous aircraft. In its P, or interceptor variant, it needed a new missile that would complement its powerful radar, great speed, and high-altitude capabilities. Once again, it would be Bisnavat at Melina that led the development effort, which began in 1959 under the Development Reference Object 46. The outcome of this process looks outwardly pretty conventional. It has a large delta planform wing at the back and canards at the front. What the arrangement disguises is the very, very large size of the missile. The radar-guided R-40R is a touch over 22 feet and 2 inches long, and it's built on a nearly 12-inch diameter missile body. Wingspan is 4.5 feet. All-up weight was 1,003 pounds in the radar version. The IR missile was actually a bit heavier at 1,031 pounds, although it was 1.5 feet shorter due to the more compact seeker. There's a lot made about how the R-40 was the largest air-to-air missile in the world. In actuality, by weight, the AIM-54C Phoenix sat between the radar and IR versions of the Acrid, and the AA-5 missile is actually heavier than both by 50 pounds. Never let hype spoil an actual fact, though. In physical dimensions, the Acrid is a big boy. Wikipedia would have it that it's larger than a Hawk Sam, which I might add was carried into combat on at least one occasion by Iranian F-14s. The Hawk was only 16 feet 8 inches long, but it was on a 14.5-inch body, so yes, the Acrid is dimensionally larger. The Hawk weighs 1,290 pounds, though. Facts, irritating facts. Anyway, front to back, both versions of R-40 start with a protective cap to prevent the airflow resulting from the Foxbat's high speed from roasting the missile's sensitive electronics. For that reason, much of the missile body is made of titanium alloy. The missile's internals were externally cooled via a flow of Freon coolant from a bottle inside the pylon to keep things within the right temperature range when the missile was activated. Not very environmentally conscious, but it was the 1960s and nobody cared at that point. There was enough Freon in each bottle for 30 minutes of operation. The seeker electronics are housed behind the cap. The semi-active R-40R and its PARG-12VV seeker head could detect radar returns for steering at up to 22 miles. For the time, it was a sophisticated system that employed an inverse Cassegrain antenna as an electronic counter-countermeasure technique. It was also able to take advantage of a quite unique feature of the MiG-25's powerful Smerch radar. This pulsette didn't have a separate illumination mode, so the target had no idea that a missile had been launched at it. The R-40R was tuned to the specific radar frequency and pulse repetition frequency of the launching aircraft on the pylon so that it could track the target. I believe that this was the function of the characteristically large rear antenna on the missile. Finally, it also had a home-on-jam feature, which I think is the first in an operational missile. In the IR missile, the sensor could be slave to the Foxbat's TP-26 thermal direction finder. It was apparently able to track a bomber out to 18 miles from the rear and 9 miles from the front quarter, which is impressive if true. I suspect in reality this was only the case in favourable conditions, though. The sensor was externally cooled by liquid nitrogen contained in a bottle in the section immediately after the seeker head. External cooling of the missile seekers led to some differences in the MiG-25's pylons. Although all pylons have the coolant bottles, the larger inboard pylons have more bottles and are thus the usual place for the IR missiles to hang. Aft of the sensor station is the mounting point for the rudders, which were electrically powered. To supply power, a fairing runs from this section to the rear where the turbo generators are housed. The fairing also contains a waveguide for the radar. The generator was spun up by compressed air when it was on the pylon. There was enough air in each bottle for 7 minutes of continuous operation. Behind the rudders was the fuse, which was a combination radar and optical type. It's the same unit that was installed in the R4TM Ash, although the R40 came first and the unit was then installed in the older missile as an upgrade to defeat US ECM. The aerial is right at the back of the missile. There was a switch marked Terrain in the MiG-25's cockpit, which deactivated the proximity fuse so it could be used to attack ground targets. IR missiles would use their seeker to do so. Radar missiles could be launched dumb via the MiG's collimating gun sight, like the largest and most expensive direct-fire rocket in history. The flight control system that determined how to turn signals from the sensors into steering instructions for the rudders was also housed in this section of the missile. It was an analog type, but I don't have much information beyond that. The rocket motor sits behind the fuse and the guidance computer. In a retro twist, the two ventral rocket exhausts are in this section, and as are the mounting lugs for the pylon attachment. The motor was a 260-pound PRD-134 single-stage rocket. Its exact power output is quite hard to come by, but logically it must give higher thrust than the Ash's PRD-84, which delivered 54,000 pounds over 5 to 7 seconds. The Acrid was apparently capable of speeds as high as Mach 4.5 versus 2.9 for the Ash. This could be accounted for by the speed of the launching aircraft, as the MiG-25 could launch it up to 1.2 Mach faster than the Tu-128. I therefore think it's reasonable to surmise that the PRD-134 delivered somewhere between 50 and 60,000 pounds of thrust. After all, the Acrid's range was fairly unremarkable for such a large weapon, although it was quite impressive for 1960. 20 miles is usually quoted as the outer limit for a hit in pursuit mode and 30 miles when launched head-on, although the chances of getting a kill there are pretty limited due to the guidance system, which had a maximum detection range of 20 miles, as well as the dynamic limitations of the missile. The back section of the missile contains the blast fragmentation warhead, which was arranged to create a cone of fragments to envelop the target. Lethal radius was given as up to 65 feet against large targets and up to 23 feet against small ones. The manual for the MiG-25 says that the initial R40 had an 83.7 pound warhead, and the updated R40D models all had a 121 pound unit. Both are continuous rod types. The smaller one breaks into 1800 fragments, the larger into 2600. The aileron actuators are also at the rear, electrically powered by a turbo generator driven by bleed gas from the rocket motor. There's a tracer in this back section to allow the pilot to keep track of the missile after the motor had burned out. I'm not sure whether this was a permanent fixture or if it could be removed if required. And then right at the back of the missile is the aerial for the 2-channel radar proximity fuse, which I believe also served as the waveguide for tuning the missile to the Foxbat's radar when it was on the pylon. As I said, this was a big missile, but it wasn't really an especially sophisticated one. The large frame meant it packed a powerful motor and large wings, enabling it to be effective from 8,000 feet to 90,000 and against targets travelling up to Mach 2 in pursuit mode. In typical Soviet fashion, a pair of infrared and a pair of radar missiles would be carried unless the Foxbat was going after a very fast target. Since drag from 4 missiles knocked 20,000 feet off the ceiling and restricted speed to below Mach 2.4, the high-speed pursuit mission called for 2 missiles only. After Belenko's defection in 1976, a major upgrade of the MiG-25P was made. This resulted in a new radar called Sapphire 23, and thus new versions of the R40 designated RD and TD. The infrared version received a new sensor with improved all-aspect capability. Its maximum kill range in the rear quarter thus went up to 30 miles. The radar version had the Park 12 replaced with the RGS-24 detector, leading to increased range of up to 48 miles and greater capability against low-flying aircraft. The RD could now be launched in a 4G turn, up from 2.5G in the original, improving its quite limited capabilities against other fighters and tactical strike aircraft. As I mentioned before, warhead weight went up 45% in these versions. It was an RD that Lieutenant Zuhair Dawood used to shoot down a US FA-18 Hornet on the first night of Desert Storm. He locked onto the Navy jet, which was flying at 28,000 feet from 20 miles, and launched a single R-40 RD at about 16 miles. The missile tracked perfectly, and Dawood observed a very large explosion. Later examination of the flight recorder showed that the R-40 detonated from the left side. The warhead functioned exactly as Bisnavat's designer had intended, showering the FA-18 with hurtling fragments. The explosion instantly slewed the aircraft 50 to 60 degrees to the right, causing 6G side forces that sheared off the external fuel tanks and their pylons, as well as one of the HARM missiles it was carrying. An R-40 also hit a US F-15 in a skirmish during the policing of the no-fly zone, but the aircraft managed to return to base. It's likely that other R-40s were used by Iraqi forces against Iran, but records are patchy. As with everything MiG-25, the hype factory would have it that the R-40 was a 60s superweapon. Is that a sensible assessment? Well, it wasn't uniquely large, as although it was long, the Phoenix was the same weight and the Ash was heavier still. It did have superior range to a contemporary Sparrow, but it was no faster. Testing of X-AIM 47 missiles demonstrated greater effective range than the upgraded version of the Acrid, and they did so as early as 1966 and 67. By the time the extended range R-40RD was in service, it was comfortably eclipsed by the Phoenix. It wasn't, however, a bad missile. When deployed, it was probably the best beyond visual range air-to-air missile in the world. The best integrated weapons system is probably a toss-up between the MiG-25P and the US Navy's F-4J Phantom. The original Acrid therefore represents the high watermark for Soviet BVR air-to-air missiles in terms of their relative performance against US and NATO equivalents. In upgraded RD and TD form, it would be used on the last interceptor deployed by either side of the Cold War, or in fact thereafter, but it would not be the Foxhound's main weapon. That title would be reserved for the last Soviet heavyweight. Just like the MiG-25, the MiG-31 needed a custom-designed weapon to suit its unique characteristics. In this case, the Foxhound's main strong point was its radar, the Zaslon S-800. This was one of the first operational phased array radars, and it uses the MiG-31's very large airframe to accommodate a sizable dish and substantial power electronics. Range was a mighty 120 miles, which edges close to that of the legendary AUG-9 in the F-14 Tomcat. I don't want to get into a debate about the merits of either system. They both have many merits, it would be fair to say, but neither of them is perfect. But then who is? Suffice to say that the MiG-31 Zaslon was a step change in the PVO's interception capabilities. The R-33 missile that armed it was also a major upgrade over the R-40. Its development was entrusted to the Vimpel State Design Bureau. Bisnavat did submit a competitive proposal called the K-50, but that was rejected. Initially, the military planned to deploy 5 versions. Those versions would be basic semi-active radar, basic IR, a combined semi-active radar and IR seeker version, an active radar version, and then one with replaceable warheads. The latter was to allow for a nuclear warhead to be fitted if necessary. After much iteration, only one version would actually reach service, combining active and semi-active radar homing. Its major innovation was the 3-stage guidance system that used an inertial navigation system for the first portion of the flight, then semi-active homing during the middle third before switching to active homing for the attack phase. There was no infrared version of the R-33, which was given the codename AA-9 Amos by NATO. Although it was initially designed to be hung on pylons, For aerodynamic reasons, the R-33 eventually changed from pylon carriage to recessed aerodynamic fairings under the Foxhound's fuselage between the engines. In this instance, that meant that conventional wings and control surfaces couldn't be fitted. The R-33 therefore has long, narrow fins, rather than the classic deltas of its predecessors. Two of the wings are foldable to nestle up against the fuselage. It's also a shorter and stockier missile than the Acrid. Front to back, the MFBU-410 Seeker head occupies much of the forward portion of the 15-inch caliber fuselage, and it's contained under a dielectric nose cone. The semi-active radar system is conventional. Multiple missiles can, however, be guided by the Zaslon simultaneously, based on coded signals sent by the phased array radar that allow individual missile control systems to distinguish between the signals that they should be using to make steering calculations. My understanding is that these codes were preloaded into the missiles prior to takeoff. The radar transmits in a rotating sequence, and the missile computer fills in the gaps. The active seeker is a bit more interesting. Western active missiles like the Phoenix used a monopulse seeker, in which a single pulse contains two or more signals with subtly different characteristics, for example, different amplitude or different phase. The way in which these reflect from the target enables the guidance computer to determine the target's relative position and its angle of movement. These systems are quite electronically complicated, though, and the Soviets went for a hybrid solution, halfway between an old-fashioned conical scanning setup and a monopulse. This is called a conopulse, and it was first theorized in the early 1970s. In a conopulse system, two antenna beams are squinted in opposite directions from the antenna axis, and then they're rotated in opposite directions. This enables monopulse information to be gathered, albeit with less precision over elevation and azimuth, as measurements are taken half as often. Conopulse has monopulse's resistance to certain types of ECM techniques, but it results in less accurate targeting information. It also requires several moving components, which means that there's more to go wrong and more maintenance is required. On the R-33, that maintenance was accomplished through an auto-test system that was used on individual rounds once a year. It was an all-digital missile, and it required no calibrations on the ground. The semi-active guidance system was sensitive enough to track a target from 55 miles. The active system took over at about 25. Maximum launch range in a head-on attack was 75 miles, with the first portion flown on autopilot. The MiG's fire control system instructed the missile where to fly and where to point the seeker head to initially track the target. Like the Phoenix, I believe it could follow a lofted trajectory at long range, climbing to 100,000 feet and then coming back down. You can see where the issues with this lie. In an extreme range shot, a relatively small movement by the target is enough to put the missile into the wrong position to detect it and make an interception. Zaslon was, however, a brand new system, and it shouldn't have triggered radar warning receivers in SAC bombers, so the PVO was initially okay with this. Sadly for them, Phasertron Radar Division engineer Alfred Tolkachev had sold the radar's details to the West, and SAC were in fact well prepared for it. He was caught and executed in 1986, leading to the post-Cold War MiG-31B being developed. Espionage issues aside, the MiG-31 had data link capability to remedy the long-range guidance issue, and the later R-33E and R-37 missiles could use it for in-flight course correction. These are well beyond the time scope of this channel, though. The guidance computer is in the section immediately behind the seeker head, with the fuse and warhead aft of them. The fuse was cued by the main guidance system, which activated it as the missile came within 2 kilometers of the target. The idea being to increase resistance to electronic interference with the fuse. A contact electromagnetic fuse was also fitted on the leading edges of the wings. The missile had a continuous rod warhead that was either 47 kilos or 103 pounds, depending on how you like to weigh things. It used a similar system to that in the R-40 in that it employed a directional blast. The rest of the missile body is basically all motor. It's actually a single-stage unit. The main wings are fixed with no ailerons. There's a gas-spun turbo generator that generates electrical power to steer the trapezoidal rear rudders. Those control all aspects of maneuver. The R-33 isn't a particularly agile missile, and it could only track a target pulling 4G or less. It was, however, pretty fast at Mach 4.5, and it was pretty heavy at 1,080 pounds. Rounding out the stats, it was 13 feet 7 inches long, and it had a narrow 3-foot wingspan. Development of the Amos had started in 1968. Test firing started in 1973, so it was quite a slow process. Curiously, the 13-year development timeline is essentially the same length as that of the Phoenix and AUG-9 a decade previously. Comparison, as I said, can wait for another day, but it should be said that the first paper in Konopol's guidance in the West wasn't published until 1976, so the Soviets were probably ahead of the game there. It should also be remembered that the MiG-31 was not a tactical fighter in 1981. It was for the PVO, and its enemies were B-52s, B-1Bs, and perhaps the odd FB-111. The Soviets did start work on an upgraded long-range version called the R-33S, which was optionally capable of using a nuclear warhead and was to be used to attack NATO's E-3 sentries. This wasn't completed before the fall of communism, though. So at the end of 2 videos on the topic, Soviet heavyweight air-to-air missiles demonstrate the doctrinal differences between NATO and the Soviet Union in terms of interceptor armament and missile development. Whereas from 1959, the F-106 went into battle carrying the 150-pound Super Falcon, the Flagon, Firebar, and Fiddler deployed with weapons weighing 4 or 5 times as much, with double or greater the range and vastly greater hitting power. Interestingly, the Soviets never developed an equivalent of the Air-2 Genie nuclear air-to-air rocket, which is, to be fair, such a ridiculous weapon as to be designated a meme only, or whatever the 1950s equivalent of that was. Interestingly, it was only the US Air Defense Command that also followed the Soviet doctrine of developing IR versions of their radar missiles. AIM-4 Falcons were, after all, available with both types of seeker, although the AIM-26 wasn't. It's also notable that during the Cold War, the US only deployed 5 air-to-air guided missile platforms: the AIM-4, the AIM-7, the AIM-9, the AIM-26, and the AIM-54. Of those, only 3 were in service in 1990. From 1960, the Soviet Union deployed 4 missile systems in the heavyweight category alone. That's heavier than the AIM-7 at least. All of them were still in service in 1990. There are 3 main reasons for this. First, the Soviets never threw anything away. Secondly, they deployed multiple integrated interceptor weapon systems of aircraft, custom-designed radar, guidance systems, and missiles. The US stopped developing these for land-based use in 1959, and they only produced 1 more thereafter, which is, of course, the Navy's F-14. Essentially, the US had relatively little to worry about from the Soviet bomber fleet, and the Soviets had a whole lot of reasons to be worried about SAC. It is in ways another illustration of how defensive Soviet doctrine really was from the late 1950s onwards. Third, there was a general philosophy within the Soviet Union in healthy times about progress. Starting from a cleanish sheet of paper was seen as virtuous and the thing to do. Strangely, that did happen in the West, but there was also a significant amount of regulatory capture, as it were, based on lobbying by defense contractors to reuse and extend the life of existing missile platforms. In terms of effectiveness, there's little point in comparing these weapons to the Sparrow, as it was used for a different purpose, even if the initial idea of an all-weather bomber killer was the same. All of the Soviet missiles outclassed the Falcon. None of them quite get to the range and potency of the Phoenix, although the R-33 is pretty close. Later developments may well have taken it beyond the AIM-54C, but it's hard to penetrate the cloak of cope that surrounds latter-day Russian technology. Ultimately, all of these missiles are an interesting reflection of a vast exercise in posturing. They were barely used, but they kept the peace, whereas their tactical cousins found plentiful employment in the proxy wars that sadly, but thankfully, defined the Cold War.